Every version of this family's origin story starts the same way. A poor girl from a Scottish island and the ambitious son of a German immigrant meet in New York, marry, and build one of the largest real estate fortunes in America, raising a future president along the way. It's a genuinely remarkable immigration story, and almost none of it is false. If you're into this kind of close-sourced history, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a lot more ground to cover. What that version usually leaves out is a household run on comparison and toughness rather than warmth. A firstborn son who was, by his own daughter's account, systematically broken down for choosing the wrong career. A federal lawsuit accusing the family business of refusing to rent to black tenants. A Senate hearing that accused the family patriarch of profiteering off veterans' housing money. A fortune quietly moved across generations through tax schemes investigators later called fraudulent. And two parents whose final years were shaped by a brutal street mugging and a long, degrading illness that the family fought over in court before either of them was even gone. Even the family's own eldest daughter, recorded without her knowledge decades later, would eventually describe the household's most famous product in blunt, unflattering terms of her own. Maryanne MacLeod and Fred Trump were married for 63 years. What that marriage actually built and cost is considerably more complicated than the plaque on any building. Maryanne MacLeod was born on May 10, 1912, in a fishing village called Tong, on Scotland's Isle of Lewis, in the remote Outer Hebrides. She was the youngest of 10 children of a fisherman and crofter, in a Gaelic-speaking community that local historians and genealogists have described, in the era she grew up in terms as blunt as indescribable human wretchedness, shaped by generations of poverty, land clearances, and a brutal North Atlantic economy. Her grandparents on both sides had roots in the surrounding villages of Vadisker and South Lochs, part of a clan MacLeod lineage that stretched back centuries on the island, though centuries of history hadn't translated into anything resembling wealth. Gaelic was her first language. She learned English only once she started school. The house she grew up in was small and gray, and the First World War had already devastated the local economy by the time she was old enough to understand it, pulling men from the island's fishing boats into a war that killed a disproportionate number of Lewis's young men relative to almost anywhere else in Britain. Her own father worked, alongside fishing, as the local compulsory attendance officer for her school, meaning he was, in a small irony, one of the few authority figures in her childhood formally responsible for making sure children like her actually showed up to be educated. There was, by every account, no plausible future in Tong for a 10th child, with no land and no inheritance coming. In 1930, at 18, Maryanne left for New York with roughly $50 to her name, joining a sister who had already emigrated to Astoria, Queens. She told immigration authorities she intended to work as a domestic, and she did, eventually finding a job as a nanny for a wealthy family before losing it in the growing wreckage of the Great Depression. In 1934, discouraged, she sailed back to Scotland. What pulled her back to New York wasn't opportunity this time, but a man, a young, ambitious real estate developer named Fred Trump, whom she'd met sometime in the early 1930s, and who reportedly courted her, at least in part, through letters while she was still in Lewis. A photograph from not long after her return shows her at a swimming pool upstate, hair newly dyed blonde, looking, in the words of one Scottish historian who later studied her correspondence, like she'd walked directly out of the pages of a Hollywood movie. It's the story of the old world becoming the new one, in a single set of photographs. If you're hooked already, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely helps get the next one made. To understand the man Maryanne was marrying into, you have to go back one more generation, to his father, Friedrich Trump, a German immigrant from the Bavarian village of Karlstadt, who arrived in New York in 1885 at 16, moving in with an older sister already living on the Lower East Side. He worked first as a barber, saved aggressively, and by 1891 had relocated to Seattle, where he sank his savings into a small restaurant that also functioned, by most surviving accounts, as an unofficial brothel, offering rooms upstairs. When word of gold in the Yukon reached Seattle in 1897, Friedrich sold the restaurant and headed north with thousands of other prospectors, though he had no real interest in mining himself. He and a partner built a restaurant and hotel in British Columbia called the Arctic, first in the boomtown of Bennett and later moved, plank by plank, to Whitehorse, which by multiple biographers' accounts also functioned as a brothel serving miners passing through on their way to the goldfields, complete with imported delicacies like fresh strawberries and roast goose served alongside the company. It worked, and worked well. Within a couple of years, he'd built a genuine nest egg. He returned to Germany in 1901 with that money, married, and later applied to reclaim his German citizenship, only to be formally expelled by Bavarian authorities for having left the country years earlier, specifically to dodge mandatory military service. Rejected by his own homeland, Friedrich brought his family back to New York for good and began building modest properties in Queens, laying the actual foundation, however uncomfortable the details, for the empire his son and grandson would eventually run. Fred Trump himself had his own brush with real controversy years before he ever met Maryanne. On Memorial Day 1927, roughly 1,000 Ku Klux Klan members marched through Jamaica, Queens, in defiance of the police, after flyers circulated in the neighborhood declaring that liberty and democracy had been trampled whenever native-born Protestant Americans dared organize to protect their flag, their public schools, and their language. A violent clash broke out between the marchers and roughly 100 officers trying to stop them, in front of a crowd estimated at 100,000 people lining the parade route. According to contemporaneous reporting in the New York Times, a 21-year-old Fred Trump was one of 7 men arrested at the scene, on a charge of refusing to disperse when ordered to. A separate local paper's account described the 7 as being among the berobed marchers themselves, though it's not entirely clear whether that description was accurate or simply assumed. He was the only one of the 7 whose charges were dismissed outright, and the surviving newspaper coverage never fully clarifies whether he was actually marching with the Klan, defending the parade route, or simply an uninvolved bystander swept up in the chaos. The address listed for him in the arrest record does match his mother's known residence at the time. Decades later, when a reporter asked Donald Trump directly whether his father had been arrested at a Klan riot, Trump denied it had ever happened, 4 separate times in the same interview, and insisted the family had lived at a different address entirely, one that turned out not to match the historical record either. Maryanne and Fred Trump married on January 11, 1936, at the Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, with a reception for just 25 guests afterward at the Carlyle Hotel. It was a modest affair by the standards the family would later become famous for, and the Stornoway Gazette, Maryanne's hometown newspaper back on Lewis, ran a small notice about it. A girl from a crofting village marrying into an up-and-coming New York business family. Fred, at the time, was already building small apartment buildings in Brooklyn and Queens under his father's old business, expanding it steadily even as the country remained deep in the Depression, using government-backed loans through the Federal Housing Administration to keep construction financing flowing when banks elsewhere had gone silent. Within a few years, the couple had moved into a large house in Jamaica Estates, Queens, and Maryanne, once a domestic worker with $50 borrowed dollars, was now the wife of a man on his way to becoming one of the wealthiest developers in New York, a rise that would only accelerate through the post-war housing boom of the late 1940s. The couple had 5 children between 1937 and 1948: Maryanne, Fred Jr., Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert. Fred ran the growing business, E. Trump and Son, with an intensity that left little room for sentiment, and by most accounts of people who worked for him, he expected the same intensity from his son specifically. Donald has said publicly, many times, that his father instilled in him the idea that life was fundamentally a competition, that you were either a killer or you weren't, and that showing weakness invited it to be exploited. At 13, after a pattern of discipline problems, Donald was sent to the New York Military Academy, an hour and a half upstate, a decision his father made largely unilaterally. Maryanne, according to multiple biographers, ran the domestic side of the household and increasingly built her own separate identity outside it, chairing fundraising committees for local hospitals, donating to Presbyterian church causes, and eventually becoming enough of a fixture in Queens philanthropic circles that she was occasionally profiled in her own right by local papers, entirely apart from her husband's growing real estate reputation. It was a composed, generous public image that complemented and quietly papered over her husband's harder edges at home. In 1954, while Donald was still a child, Fred Trump found himself testifying for more than 2 hours before a United States Senate committee investigating widespread profiteering inside the Federal Housing Administration's post-war building program. Investigators showed that Fred and a business partner had bought a small piece of land for roughly $34,000 and then leased it back to their own construction corporation for nearly $77,000 a year under a 99-year agreement, a maneuver that, combined with other inflated cost estimates, let them pocket close to $1,700,000 in rent alone, all of it ultimately backstopped by federal mortgage insurance meant to help veterans find housing after the war. A Republican senator on the committee said the details made him physically nauseous and compared the scale of the abuse to the Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s. Fred, indignant under questioning, insisted he'd done nothing wrong and that the accusations were doing untold damage to his own reputation. He was never criminally charged, and the FHA quietly blacklisted him from new federally backed projects for a period afterward, a consequence with real teeth that nonetheless barely dented the family's growing fortune or its public standing in Queens. Fred Trump's approach to fatherhood wasn't cruelty for its own sake, so much as a rigid, almost industrial theory of what made a man useful. He reportedly wanted his oldest son to be, in his own word, invulnerable, capable of running the company without sentiment getting in the way, and he graded his children's usefulness to the business the way he graded a construction bid, coldly and by results. Donald absorbed and thrived under that framework, later crediting exactly this kind of pressure, publicly and repeatedly, as the reason he became who he became. According to Mary L. Trump's memoir, and separately according to comments her aunt Maryanne later made in private, Fred's favoritism extended to actively looking the other way when Donald cut corners, including a persistent family claim, repeated by Maryanne in secretly recorded conversations decades later, that a friend named Joe Shapiro had taken Donald's college entrance exams for him. The family and the person named have denied it. Not every one of Fred's children got that same benefit of the doubt. Fred Trump Jr., the oldest son, was listed as a vice president of the family company by his mid-20s, but he had little real interest in real estate and a great deal of difficulty working for his father directly. In 1966, he left the business entirely to pursue a childhood dream of becoming a commercial airline pilot, quickly getting hired by Trans World Airlines. His father was furious, and according to Fred Jr.'s own daughter, the psychologist Mary L. Trump, both her grandfather and her uncle Donald mocked the decision relentlessly, comparing flying passenger jets to driving a bus. A family friend later told reporters there was real, lasting tension over the choice, describing both Fred Sr. and Donald as making clear they viewed the airline job as a step down from what a Trump was supposed to do with his life. In her 2020 memoir, Mary Trump wrote that her grandfather methodically dismantled Fred Jr. by devaluing and degrading every part of his personality until there was nothing left of the confident young man who'd once wanted to fly for a living. By 1970, after a series of difficult incidents at home, Fred Jr.'s wife asked him to leave their house, and his own father had the locks changed rather than intervene. By the early 1970s, worsening alcoholism forced Fred Jr. to give up flying altogether. He moved back into his parents' house, into an unfurnished attic room, and went back to doing maintenance work on his father's buildings, the very career he'd once tried to escape. Fred Trump Jr. died of a heart attack on September 26, 1981, at 42, a death both his family and later biographers have directly attributed to years of alcohol abuse. In 1994, in a rare interview with an Irish broadcaster, Maryanne described the loss in oddly clinical terms, saying simply that they had lost their oldest son, that he was 41, and that it was something a mother never forgets, getting his actual age wrong even in the act of remembering him. Donald has said publicly that watching his brother's decline is the entire reason he never drank alcohol himself, recalling that Fred Jr. used to warn him almost daily, telling him to look at the mess he'd made of his own life and never to start smoking or drinking, because he'd like it too much. Decades later, Donald Trump himself expressed genuine regret about his own role, telling reporters he wished he hadn't added to the pressure his brother felt, and admitting the family had made the mistake of assuming everyone would want to run the business the same way he did. It's one of the only moments on record where Donald has described a family failure in the first person, rather than assigning it elsewhere. In October 1973, the Justice Department sued Fred Trump, Donald Trump, and their management company for systematically violating the Fair Housing Act, alleging the firm refused to rent apartments to black applicants across their properties and, according to court documents, flagged applications from black prospective tenants with the letter C. Two women who later spoke to the New York Times described nearly identical experiences decades apart. One, a Queens schoolteacher, was told a building had no vacancies, despite an active newspaper ad, while a white acquaintance with the same request was offered an apartment on the spot. Another recalled a building superintendent simply standing outside and waiting until she left, rather than showing her anything at all. One of the women told the Times she'd learned to send white friends with red hair and obviously non-Jewish names to inquire first, since they'd get an apartment offer almost immediately where she herself had been turned away. Donald, 27 at the time and serving as the company's president, held a press conference calling the allegations absolutely ridiculous and accusing the government of targeting his company specifically because of its size and of trying to force the firm to rent to welfare recipients. He initially countersued the Justice Department for $100 million, alleging false statements. That countersuit was thrown out by the court. The case ultimately ended in a consent decree 2 years later, one the Justice Department itself called one of the most far-reaching housing discrimination settlements ever negotiated, requiring the company to actively advertise vacancies to the Urban League for 2 years and to personally familiarize themselves, in detail, with the requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Fred and Donald admitted no wrongdoing. Maryanne's name never appeared in the litigation, but she remained, throughout it, the public face of the family's Queens social and charitable circle, hosting fundraisers under the same last name the Justice Department was actively suing. On October 31, 1991, 79-year-old Maryanne was walking to a bakery near her Jamaica Estates home to pick up a crumb cake when a 16-year-old grabbed her purse and threw her to the ground. She suffered facial cuts, fractured ribs, a possible broken hip, and, most seriously, a brain hemorrhage that left her with permanent damage to her sight and hearing for the rest of her life. Her attacker had gotten away with $14. A bystander driving past in a van chased the teenager on foot into a nearby apartment building's underground passage and physically detained him until police arrived. He was later convicted of robbery and assault and sentenced to 3 to 9 years in prison. Donald, campaigning years afterward for a tougher approach to criminal justice, would occasionally invoke his mother's mugging as part of his broader argument for harsher policing, part of a pattern that had already included, 2 years earlier, a set of full-page newspaper ads he'd paid for demanding the return of the death penalty after 5 teenagers, later exonerated, were accused of a brutal Central Park assault. The timing of his mother's own attack, regardless, was almost unbearably layered. That same year, her husband was formally diagnosed with what doctors then called mild senile dementia, the earliest documented stage of the Alzheimer's disease that would consume the rest of his life. And her son Donald's marriage to his first wife was collapsing in the tabloids, in exactly the kind of coverage that made the family name a punchline. In the span of a single year, both of Maryanne's own health and her husband's mind had begun a decline that neither of them would recover from. Fred Trump's Alzheimer's progressed steadily through the 1990s, after doctors first diagnosed him with what they called mild senile dementia in 1991, at 86, a diagnosis that within a couple of years had progressed into full Alzheimer's disease. Family friends later described him coming downstairs wearing 3 ties at once, or failing to recognize employees and relatives he'd known for decades. Multiple sources, including people close to the family, have said that by the end, Donald's face was one of the very few he could still reliably place. The disease created an opening. With Fred's estate now worth close to $1 billion and his judgment badly compromised, Donald and his surviving siblings moved to consolidate control of the company and, eventually, of Fred's will itself, restructuring ownership through a subsidiary in 1992, specifically designed, according to later reporting, to funnel his fortune to his children while he was still alive to sign the paperwork. When Fred Jr.'s own two children, Fred III and Mary, later learned they'd been written out of the will entirely, receiving a flat $200,000 each instead of the larger share their late father would have inherited, they sued, arguing their grandfather had been manipulated into cutting them out, while his Alzheimer's left him unable to meaningfully understand what he was signing. The lawsuit got uglier than a straightforward inheritance dispute. Fred III's infant son, William, was born with a severe neurological condition, cerebral palsy accompanied by seizures, requiring round-the-clock nursing care, feeding tubes, and specialized equipment, and for years, the extended family had quietly covered those costs through the same health insurance plan that covered the rest of the Trumps, a benefit Fred Sr. himself had specifically arranged before his decline. Once Fred III filed suit over the will, that coverage was cut off within weeks, leaving the family facing medical bills that eventually topped $300,000, according to court filings and later reporting. Asked about it directly by a reporter at the time, Donald offered no apology, saying flatly that his ill grandnephew's medical coverage had been revoked because his father had chosen to sue the family, and that things might have gone differently if he'd simply come to talk to him instead. He added, when pressed on whether denying a sick infant coverage seemed cold, only that he couldn't help it, that it was cold when someone sued his own father. The case was eventually settled later that year, with the family restoring some support, but the sequence, cutting off a sick infant's insurance in apparent response to a lawsuit over a dead man's estate, became one of the more widely cited illustrations of exactly how far the family's internal warfare was willing to go. In 2018, a lengthy New York Times investigation, built on tens of thousands of pages of financial records, concluded that Fred and Maryanne Trump had transferred more than $1 billion in wealth to their children over the decades using tax strategies the paper's experts described as including instances of outright fraud, among them a shell company allegedly used to siphon money out of Fred's properties, and, separately, wildly undervalued property appraisals used to minimize the taxable size of his estate. The Times calculated the family should have owed roughly $550 million in gift and estate taxes. Records show they paid just over $52 million. The paper reported that Fred regularly consulted with his eldest daughter, Maryanne, a sitting federal appeals court judge by then, about the family's legal and financial affairs, and that she was present at Trump Tower meetings, where the siblings and the company's longtime chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, reviewed the inherited empire, years before Weisselberg himself would later plead guilty to tax fraud in a separate criminal case brought against the Trump Organization. Donald's lawyers called the entire investigation false and defamatory. New York State's tax department opened a review into the allegations regardless. Whatever the legal outcome, the documents made one thing clear. Maryanne wasn't a passive bystander to her husband's business empire in these final years. Her name was on the same transfers. That same eldest daughter, Maryanne Trump Barry, ended up giving one of the more revealing insider verdicts on the whole family, though not intentionally. Between 2018 and 2019, her niece Mary Trump secretly recorded roughly 15 hours of private conversation with her, material that surfaced publicly in 2020, alongside Mary's own tell-all memoir about the family. On tape, Maryanne, by then a retired federal appeals judge in her 80s, called her brother Donald cruel, phony, and someone with, in her words, no principles, none, adding that the constant lying and shifting stories left her saying holy shit to herself in disbelief. She's also heard telling her niece that she believed her brother had committed what she, a devout Catholic, called a sin by invoking their late brother Fred Jr.'s death from alcoholism while publicly discussing the opioid epidemic, treating a genuine family tragedy as a talking point. Asked by Mary Trump whether anyone actually believed Donald had built his fortune entirely on his own, Maryanne reportedly answered simply that he'd had 5 bankruptcies. The White House dismissed the tapes as a partisan attack from a disgruntled relative. Whatever the motive behind releasing them, they're the closest thing that exists to an under-oath character reference from someone who watched this particular family and this particular marriage's aftermath from the inside for 80 years. Fred Trump died on June 25, 1999, at 93, after roughly a decade of advancing Alzheimer's disease that had, by the end, erased most of the people and memories that once defined him. Maryanne survived him by just over a year, dying on August 7, 2000, at 88, her final years shaped by the lasting physical damage from the 1991 attack far more than by any cognitive decline of her own. They're buried together at All Faiths Cemetery in Queens, not far from the borough, where a poor domestic worker from a Scottish fishing village and the son of a brothel keeper turned German-American developer had, 63 years earlier, quietly built a family empire. Neither of them lived to fully watch play out. Their youngest son, Robert, the one child who mostly stayed out of the spotlight and out of the family's public fights, died 2 decades later, in August 2020, prompting a brief statement from Donald, calling him not just his brother, but his best friend, a rare moment of unguarded sentiment from a family that otherwise processed most of its grief, as it had processed most things, in public and on a schedule. The version of this marriage that made it into campaign biographies and hagiographic magazine profiles is a tidy immigrant success story, hard work, discipline, and a fortune built from nothing. Look closer, and the same marriage produced a son, so thoroughly diminished by his father's contempt that he drank himself to death at 42, a federal lawsuit over refusing housing to black families, a Senate committee that called the father's own business practices nauseating, a decades-old and still unresolved question about a Klan riot, arrest the family has flatly denied. A fortune moved across generations through methods investigators called fraudulent, a sick infant whose medical coverage was cut off in the middle of a family lawsuit, a mother whose own final decade was defined as much by a violent mugging on a Queens sidewalk as by any of the wealth around her, and, eventually, the family's own eldest daughter privately calling its most famous son cruel and principle-free. None of that erases the real immigrant story underneath it, a fisherman's daughter from the Outer Hebrides who crossed an ocean twice with almost nothing and ended up the matriarch of one of the most famous families in the world. It just means the plaque on the building was never the whole story, and in this family, it rarely was. The gray house Maryanne grew up in still stands in Tong, and locals on Lewis have described treating it, in later decades, as something between a curiosity and an embarrassment, a modest crofter's cottage forever tied to a surname most of the island wants little to do with. Filmmakers and genealogists who've gone back through her old pen pal letters home describe watching her transform, photograph by photograph, from a domestic worker with a headscarf into a woman who could pass for a character out of a Hollywood picture, dyed blonde hair and all, without ever fully losing the Gaelic cadence in her voice when she spoke to people from home. Donald Trump has visited the island himself more than once as an adult, walking the same narrow roads his mother left behind at 18, with $50 and no plan to come back rich. Polling in Scotland has consistently shown him deeply unpopular there, a strange inversion for a country that produced the woman without whom none of the rest of this family's story happens at all. Go back to that gray house on Lewis, and then forward 60-some years to a mansion in Queens with an ailing man in it who could no longer recognize most of his own children. Both of those places belonged, at different points, to the same marriage. Neither one was ever really the whole picture on its own.